Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we delve into another case file, one that explores the darkest corners of human nature. The family unit is meant to be our ultimate sanctuary, a circle of unwavering trust. But what happens when this sacred bond is corrupted by the oldest of temptations? Money? We will explore a chilling case where greed transforms love into a liability and family members become cold-blooded conspirators. This is the story of an inheritance plot calculated betrayal where the ultimate price for wealth was paid in blood by one of their own. Case 1. The Beverly Hills Betrayal. The notorious case of two privileged brothers who murdered their parents for a vast fortune. In the geography of American wealth, few addresses carry the same weight as Beverly Hills, California. It is a world of manicured lawns, towering palm trees, and sprawling mansions that stand as monuments to success. Behind the gates of these homes, life is meant to be a portrait of idyllic privilege. It was within this gilded world, at 722 North Elm Drive, that the Menendez family resided. And it was here that one of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century would unfold, shattering the illusion of the perfect family and exposing a rot of dysfunction and greed so profound it became a national obsession. The patriarch, Jose Menendez, was the embodiment of the American dream, ruthlessly pursued. A Cuban immigrant who arrived in America with nothing, he had clawed his way to the top, becoming a spectacularly successful and notoriously demanding entertainment executive. He was the CEO of Live Entertainment, a video distribution company. Jose was driven, charismatic in a boardroom, but at home, his ambition manifested as tyranny. He ruled his family with an iron fist, demanding perfection from his two sons, Lyle and Eric. He was a man who equated love with achievement and saw his children as extensions of his own legacy. His wife, Mary Louise "Kitty" Menendez, was a former beauty queen, a woman who seemed to have everything but was, by all accounts, deeply unhappy. She was emotionally fragile, prone to bouts of depression, and lived in the shadow of her domineering husband. Her relationship with her sons was complex, a mixture of maternal affection, enmeshment, and a shared feeling of being oppressed by Jose. The family portrait was one of affluence and opportunity, but the brushstrokes, upon closer inspection, were painted with fear, resentment, and profound psychological distress. The sons, Joseph Lyle, born in 1968, and Eric Galen, born in 1970, were the heirs to this complicated kingdom. They were handsome, intelligent, and given every advantage money could buy: elite private schools, expensive cars, and coaching for promising careers in tennis. But beneath the surface of privilege, they were floundering. Lyle, the elder, was arrogant and domineering, a pale imitation of his father. He was expelled from Princeton University for plagiarism. Eric, the younger, was more sensitive, introverted, and shy. He was a gifted tennis player but struggled under the immense pressure to succeed. Both boys were, in the eyes of their father, profound disappointments. They were failing to live up to the impossible standards he had set. The tension within the walls of 722 North Elm Drive was a palpable, living thing. On the night of August 20th, 1989, that tension exploded in an act of shocking, unthinkable violence. Jose and Kitty were relaxing in the den of their mansion, watching a movie. They were unaware that their sons had just returned home, armed with two 12-gauge Mossberg shotguns they had purchased just days earlier. Lyle and Eric entered the den. What happened next was not a crime of passion, but a brutal, systematic execution. Lyle fired the first shot, hitting his father in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Eric, frozen for a moment in horror, was urged by his brother to fire. He shot his mother as she tried to scramble away. The initial shots were not enough. In a frenzy of violence that the prosecution would later describe as overkill, the brothers continued to fire, reloading their weapons as they did. They shot their mother in the arms, chest, and face, rendering her unrecognizable. They shot their father in the kneecap, a deliberate mutilation intended to suggest a mob-style hit, a narrative they hoped would deflect suspicion from themselves. In total, 15 shots were fired. The den, a symbol of their family's wealth and status, was transformed into a blood-soaked slaughterhouse. Their work done, the brothers carefully collected the spent shotgun shells. They drove up to Mulholland Drive, a winding road in the hills above the city, and discarded the shotguns into a canyon. Then they set about creating an alibi. They bought tickets for the film Batman at a local cinema and made a point of trying to meet a friend at a food festival, ensuring they would be seen. Later that night, hours after the murders, Lyle Menendez placed a frantic, hysterical call to 911. "Somebody kill my parents," he screamed, his voice choked with what sounded like profound grief and shock. When the police arrived, they found a gruesome scene and 2 apparently devastated sons. The initial theory, just as the brothers had planned, leaned toward a professional hit connected to Jose's sometimes ruthless business dealings. The boys, seemingly overcome with sorrow, were taken to a neighbor's house for comfort. The perfect crime seemed, for a moment, to be a success. But the facade of the grieving orphans began to crumble almost immediately. The first cracks appeared not in their story, but in their behavior. In the days and weeks following the murders, Lyle and Eric embarked on an astonishing spending spree, blowing through an estimated $700,000 of their parents' money in just 6 months. Lyle bought a new Porsche Carrera, a $3,000 Rolex watch, and invested in a restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey, which he renamed Chuck's Spring Street Cafe. Eric hired a full-time personal tennis coach for $60,000 a year and began competing in tournaments in Israel. They threw lavish parties, traveled, and lived like young kings who had just been handed the keys to their kingdom. Their profligate spending raised red flags with investigators. This was not the behavior of sons consumed by grief. It was the behavior of men celebrating their newfound freedom and wealth. The police began to look at the brothers not as victims, but as prime suspects. The true breaking point, however, came from Eric's conscience. Weighed down by the immense guilt of what he had done, the younger, more sensitive brother confessed. But he did not confess to the police. He confessed to a psychologist, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. In a series of recorded therapy sessions, Eric laid out the entire plot in horrifying detail, from the planning to the execution to the cover-up. He implicated himself and his brother completely. Dr. Oziel, in a staggering breach of ethics, saw the confession not as a therapeutic breakthrough but as an opportunity for control. He was embroiled in a messy affair with a woman named Judalon Smith, and he began using his knowledge of the murders to manipulate not only Eric but Lyle as well. He would hold therapy sessions with both brothers, sessions which Smith would often overhear. The brothers, realizing their secret was now in the hands of this unstable psychologist and his volatile mistress, became threatening. Smith, fearing for her own life, eventually went to the police in March of 1990. She told them everything she knew. Armed with Smith's testimony and the existence of the confession tapes, the investigation zeroed in. On March 8, 1990, Lyle Menendez was arrested at the family mansion. Eric, who was in Israel for a tennis tournament, surrendered to authorities upon his return a few days later. The story of the orphan sons had ended. The story of the parricidal brothers had begun. What followed was one of the most sensational legal battles in American history, a case that would be broadcast live on court TV, captivating and dividing the nation. The prosecution's case was straightforward. This was a simple, brutal murder for money. The brothers, tired of waiting for their inheritance, estimated at $14 million, and fed up with their domineering father, decided to kill their parents to gain access to the family fortune and live a life of unfettered luxury. The spending spree was their star exhibit, a clear window into the defendants' true motives. But the defense, led by the brilliant and tenacious attorney Leslie Abramson, who represented Eric, unveiled a strategy that would change the entire narrative. They admitted that the brothers had killed their parents. The question was not if they did it, but why. Abramson argued this was not a murder for greed, but a desperate act of self-preservation. For years, she claimed, the brothers had been the victims of horrific, ongoing sexual, physical, and psychological abuse at the hands of both parents. Jose was the monstrous sexual predator, and Kitty was his passive, often drunk, accomplice who did nothing to stop him and sometimes participated in the emotional abuse. The trial became a public dissection of the Menendez family's darkest secrets. Lyle and Eric took the stand, delivering days of harrowing, tearful testimony. They described a childhood that was not one of privilege, but of terror. They spoke of unspeakable acts, of constant fear, and of a lifetime of trauma. They claimed that on the night of the murders, they believed their parents were about to kill them to prevent the secret of the abuse from ever being revealed. The killings, in their telling, were a preemptive strike, a tragic but necessary act of survival. The public was torn. Were these boys cold, calculating sociopaths who had created an elaborate story of abuse to escape justice? Or were they deeply damaged victims who had finally snapped after a lifetime of torture? The evidence was ambiguous. There was no physical proof of the abuse, only the brothers' own words. The prosecution hammered on the fact that no one, not friends, not teachers, not other family members, had ever reported or suspected any abuse. The first trial, which began in 1993, ended in a stunning outcome. The jury, unable to reconcile the two competing narratives, was hopelessly deadlocked. Two separate juries, one for each brother, could not reach a unanimous verdict. Some jurors believed the abuse claims and voted for a lesser charge of manslaughter. Others believed the prosecution's greed motive and voted for first-degree murder. A mistrial was declared. The second trial began in 1995, but the landscape had shifted. This time, there would be one judge and one jury for both brothers. The new judge, Stanley Weisberg, was far less sympathetic to the defense. He severely limited the testimony about the alleged abuse, ruling that its relevance to the brothers' state of mind on the night of the murders was tenuous. He also, crucially, barred television cameras from the courtroom, removing the element of public spectacle that had defined the first trial. Without the ability to fully present their abuse narrative, the defense was crippled. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney David Kahn, relentlessly focused the jury's attention on the facts of the crime, the brutal, execution-style nature of the killings, the careful planning, and the lavish spending spree that followed. He painted the brothers not as victims, but as greedy, spoiled predators. This time, the strategy worked. On March 20th, 1996, after years of legal battles, Lyle and Eric Menendez were found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury had rejected the abuse defense and accepted the story of a cold-blooded inheritance plot. The prosecution had sought the death penalty, but the jury, perhaps with some lingering sympathy, recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole. On July 2nd, 1996, they were formally sentenced. In the years since, Lyle and Eric Menendez have been serving their sentences in the California prison system. For over 2 decades, they were held in separate facilities, but in 2018, They were reunited in the same housing unit. Both have gotten married while incarcerated. The Menendez brothers' case remains a cultural touchstone, a dark fairy tale of American wealth and dysfunction. It forced a national conversation about patricide, the lasting trauma of child abuse, and the corrupting influence of extreme wealth. But at its core, it is a story about the complete and utter collapse of a family. The betrayal was absolute, a violation of the most fundamental bond of trust. The inheritance they so violently sought was not just a fortune of $14 million. It was a legacy of pain, secrets, and violence. They got the money, but the price was their freedom, their souls, and the lives of the two people who gave them life. The story of the Menendez family serves as a chilling testament to the fact that the most horrifying monsters can sometimes be found not in the shadows, but seated across the dinner table. Case 2. A Mother's Poisonous Plan. A mother manipulates her children into a plot to murder their stepfather for his insurance payout. We move now to the suburban landscapes of upstate New York, a region known for its harsh winters and quiet, working-class communities. Our story centers on the town of Clay, near Syracuse, a place where family life is the bedrock of society. It is here we encounter Stacy Castor, a woman who, to the outside world, appeared to be tragically unlucky, a figure deserving of immense sympathy. She was twice widowed, a single mother raising two daughters against a backdrop of unthinkable loss. But beneath this veneer of victimhood lay a chilling and predatory nature. This is the story of how a mother's greed became a poison, not just literally, but figuratively, seeping into the very foundations of her family until it threatened to consume her own children. The first tragedy struck in the year 2000. Stacy's husband, Michael Wallace, the father of her two daughters, Ashley and Bree, was found dead in their bedroom. Michael was 38 years old, a gregarious and well-liked man who ran a successful heating and air conditioning company. He had been ill, complaining of a cough and seeming unsteady on his feet. The family doctor had dismissed it as a virus. When Stacy found him unresponsive, she called for help, but it was too late. The coroner, given the reports of his recent illness, ruled his death a heart attack. There was no autopsy. Stacy, now a widow with two young girls, inherited the house and a modest life insurance policy. The community rallied around her, their hearts breaking for the young family so suddenly shattered. Life moved on. Stacy, resilient and seemingly determined to provide a stable home for her daughters, eventually found love again. In 2003, she married David Castor, a quiet, hard-working man who owned an installation and repair company. David was a good man by all accounts. He embraced his role as a stepfather, providing for Ashley and Bree. He and Stacy settled into a comfortable life in a new home. For a time, it seemed that the cloud of tragedy that had hung over Stacy had finally lifted. But in the late summer of 2005, the pattern began to repeat itself with an eerie familiarity. David Castor, like Michael Wallace before him, began to fall ill. He became lethargic, started coughing, and seemed disoriented. Stacy told friends and family that he was depressed, that he had locked himself in their bedroom, refusing to eat or speak with anyone. She portrayed herself as the long-suffering wife, trying desperately to care for a husband who was pushing her away. On the afternoon of August 22, 2005, the second tragedy struck. Stacy Castor placed a panicked 911 call. Her husband, she said, was not breathing. She had been out of the house, and when she returned, she found him unresponsive in their bed. When paramedics arrived, they found 48-year-old David Castor dead. On the nightstand beside the bed was a glass half full of a bright green liquid. Nearby, a container of antifreeze sat on the floor. To the initial investigators, The scene seemed to point to a clear, if tragic, conclusion: suicide. The distraught wife, the depression, the glass of poison, it all fit a recognizable narrative. The case seemed destined to be closed quickly. But one officer at the scene, Sergeant Robert Lynch of the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office, felt a deep sense of unease. Something about the scene was too perfect, too staged. He looked at Stacy Castor, the woman who was now a two-time widow before the age of 40, and a seed of suspicion was planted. His suspicion was validated when the autopsy results came back. The medical examiner confirmed that David Castor had died of ethylene glycol poisoning, the primary toxic ingredient in antifreeze. It is a gruesome, agonizing way to die, causing the body's systems to shut down one by one as the chemical crystallizes in the organs. But the examiner also noted something else. The amount of poison in David's system was so massive that he would have been rendered unconscious and incapable of movement long before he could have finished drinking that much. This suggested he had not drunk it willingly. The theory of suicide was beginning to unravel. Sergeant Lynch, acting on his hunch, ordered forensic investigators to search the house for any evidence that might suggest foul play. It was in the kitchen that they found a crucial clue, one that would become central to the entire case: a turkey baster in the trash can. When tested, the turkey baster showed traces of ethylene glycol, as well as David Castor's DNA on the tip. A horrifying new theory began to form. Had David Castor been force-fed the poison, perhaps while he was too weak to resist? The investigation, which had begun as a routine suicide inquiry, was now a full-blown homicide investigation, with Stacy Castor as the primary suspect. Investigators began to dig into Stacy's past, and the death of her first husband, Michael Wallace, was immediately re-examined. The fact that he had died of a supposed heart attack, with no autopsy, now seemed incredibly convenient. Sergeant Lynch and his team secured a court order to have Michael Wallace's body exhumed. His remains, buried for 5 years, were brought to the medical examiner's office. When toxicology tests were performed, they found the unmistakable presence of ethylene glycol crystals in his organs. Michael Wallace had not died of a heart attack. He, too, had been poisoned. Stacy Castor had not been unlucky. She had been ruthlessly efficient. She had, investigators believed, murdered both of her husbands for their assets and life insurance policies, making it look like natural death in one case and suicide in the other. But proving it would be difficult. Stacy was clever. She stuck to her story, maintaining her innocence and portraying herself as the victim of a police vendetta. Prosecutors knew they had a strong circumstantial case, but they lacked the single, undeniable piece of evidence that would tie Stacy directly to the crimes. Then they found it. On David Castor's computer, investigators discovered what appeared to be a suicide note. It was a long, rambling confession, supposedly typed by David, in which he admitted to murdering Michael Wallace years earlier out of guilt and jealousy, and now, unable to live with himself, was taking his own life. The note read in part, "I am the one who killed Michael Wallace. I am writing this to you because I can't live with myself anymore. I did it with antifree in his drink." On the surface, it was the perfect note to exonerate Stacy. It was a confession from a dead man. But to the forensic computer analysts, it was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. First, they determined the note had been created at a time when medical evidence showed David Castor was either comatose or already dead. He could not have typed it. Second, and most damningly, was a single, repeated misspelling. Throughout the note, the word antifreeze was misspelled as anti-free. When investigators interviewed friends and family, they asked a simple question: did anyone know if Stacy had a particular way of saying the word antifreeze? The answer was yes. She often pronounced it and even wrote it as two distinct words, anti-free. It was her own personal linguistic quirk. The supposed suicide note, which was meant to be her salvation, had become her signature on a confession. Armed with this powerful evidence, investigators brought Stacy in for a grueling, multi-hour interrogation in September 2007. They confronted her with the evidence, the exhumation, the turkey baster, the computer forensics. And then Sergeant Lynch dropped the bombshell. He told her that her fingerprints had been found on the glass containing the antifreeze. This was a bluff. The glass had been wiped clean, but it was designed to provoke a reaction. Stacy did not confess. Instead, her mind immediately went to a dark and desperate place. "I'm not a murderer," she said, her voice shaking, "but I know who did it." She then accused her own daughter, Ashley, of committing both murders. This was the beginning of the most monstrous act in a story already filled with them. Stacy, feeling the net tighten around her, decided to sacrifice her own child to save herself. She devised a plan not just to frame Ashley, but to eliminate her as a potential witness. A few days after the interrogation, Stacy's younger daughter, Bree, called 911 in a panic. She had found her older sister, Ashley, then 20, unconscious in her bed. Beside the bed was a typed suicide note and a bottle of pills. The note was a supposed confession from Ashley, admitting that she had murdered both her stepfathers and was now, overwhelmed with guilt, taking her own life. Ashley was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors found she had been poisoned with a potent cocktail of crushed pills mixed with alcohol and orange juice. For a time, it seemed she would not survive. But against all odds, Ashley Wallace pulled through. When she finally regained consciousness, her mother, Stacy, was at her bedside, comforting her, telling her everything would be okay. But when investigators were finally able to speak with Ashley, a different story emerged. Ashley had no memory of writing a suicide note or trying to kill herself. What she did remember was her mother preparing a drink for her the night she fell ill. She said her mother told her it was vodka and orange juice to help her relax. Ashley remembered the drink tasted foul, but she drank it because her mother, the person she trusted most in the world, had given it to her. Then, prosecutors showed Ashley this suicide note found in her room. As Ashley read the words supposedly written by her, she broke down. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But it contained the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. The note was filled with details that only the killer would know. It was, investigators realized, a confession dictated by Stacy to her daughter, disguised as a suicide note. The trial of Stacy Castor began in early 2009. The prosecution laid out the story of the Black Widow, a woman who killed for financial gain and was willing to murder her own daughter to cover her tracks. The most powerful and heartbreaking moments of the trial came when Ashley Wallace took the stand to testify against her mother. In a clear, steady voice, she recounted the night of her poisoning. She told the jury about the drink her mother gave her, the foul taste, and how her mother had stood over her as she drank it. The prosecution then presented the linguistic evidence of the anti-free misspelling from David's suicide note. They asked Ashley if she had ever heard anyone use that term. Ashley replied, "My mother." The connection was absolute. On February 5, 2009, the jury found Stacy Castor guilty of second-degree murder in the death of David Castor and of first-degree attempted murder for the poisoning of her daughter, Ashley. She was also found guilty of forging David Castor's will. She was acquitted of murdering Michael Wallace only because the statute of limitations had passed. At her sentencing, Stacy remained defiant, addressing the court and insisting on her innocence. She was sentenced to 25 years to life for the murder, plus another 25 years for the attempted murder of her daughter. The judge called her a cold-blooded, calculating, and heinous murderer. The case of Stacy Castor is a deeply disturbing look at the perversion of the maternal bond. It is a story where the roles of protector and predator became one and the same. Her inheritance plot was not just about money. It was about a profound and terrifying narcissism, a willingness to annihilate her entire family for her own selfish ends. She poisoned her husbands for their assets and tried to poison her child for her freedom. In the end, the only legacy she left her daughters was a lifetime of trauma and the horrifying knowledge that the person who was supposed to be their greatest protector was, in fact, their most dangerous enemy. Case 3. The Gold-Plated Grandson. A young man's descent from favored heir to cold-blooded killer to secure his wealthy father's estate. There is a particular kind of darkness that thrives in the rarefied air of extreme wealth. It is a corrosion of the soul that can happen when privilege is so absolute it curdles into a toxic sense of entitlement. Our next case takes us into this world, to the heart of Manhattan's elite, where the family name is a brand and the address is a statement. This is the story of Thomas Gilbert Jr., a man who was given everything a Princeton education, a life of leisure, a golden future, but for whom everything was still not enough. It is a chilling examination of a son who saw his own father not as a source of love and support, but as an obstacle standing between him and the money he believed was his birthright. Thomas Gilbert Sr. was a titan of Wall Street. He was the founder of Wainscott Capital Partners, a successful hedge fund that had afforded his family a life of extraordinary luxury. Their world was one of private schools in Manhattan, sprawling summer homes in the Hamptons, and memberships to exclusive country clubs. Thomas Sr. was a self-made man in a world of inherited wealth, a hard-working and intensely driven financier. He was a man who understood the value of a dollar because he had earned every single one of them. His son, Thomas Gilbert Jr., known as Tommy, was the product of this world, yet he seemed to possess none of his father's drive. On the surface, he was the picture of patrician perfection, tall, blonde, handsome, with the easy confidence of someone who had never known struggle. He followed the prescribed path of the elite, attending the prestigious Buckley School and Deerfield Academy before enrolling at Princeton University. He looked the part of a future captain of industry, a worthy heir to the Gilbert dynasty. But the handsome facade concealed a deeply troubled and dysfunctional reality. Tommy was a ghost in his own life. Despite his Princeton degree, he was chronically unemployed, drifting through his 20s and into his 3_0_S with no career, no ambition, and no direction. His life was a series of hobbies and failed ventures, all funded by his parents. He dabbled in surfing, tried to start a hedge fund of his own which quickly failed, and spent his days at the gym or the country club. He was a 30-year-old man living the life of an indulged adolescent, entirely dependent on a weekly allowance and a generous subsidy from his father that covered the rent on his chic Chelsea apartment and all his expenses. The family's immense wealth had become a gilded cage for Tommy, insulating him from the realities and responsibilities of adulthood. It had fostered in him a profound and dangerous sense of entitlement. The money was not a gift. In his mind, it was an obligation his parents owed him. Beneath the surface of this arrested development, a more sinister problem was festering: Tommy's deteriorating mental health. Friends and family noted his increasing paranoia, his obsessive tendencies, and his erratic behavior. He was convinced people were spying on him, that he was the target of vague conspiracies. His anger could be explosive and disproportionate to the situation. In 2014, his escalating aggression culminated in a bizarre and violent act. He brutally assaulted his former roommate, Peter Smith, over a perceived slight, and was charged with violating a restraining order Smith had taken out against him. A more frightening incident occurred at the family's Hamptons estate. Tommy, in a fit of paranoia, burned the house down, convinced it was an act of righteous justice against a demon he believed inhabited it. His father, ever the protector of the family name, covered up the incident, claiming it was an electrical fire to avoid scandal and a criminal investigation. But the event was a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of Tommy's psyche. He was not just spoiled. He was unwell. Thomas Sr. and his wife, Shelley, were caught in an impossible bind. They loved their son, but they were also increasingly frightened of him and deeply frustrated by his inability to launch his own life. Thomas Sr., a man who valued hard work above all else, began to see that his financial support was not helping his son, but enabling his dysfunction. He started to slowly tighten the purse strings, hoping to force Tommy into self-sufficiency. It was a logical, paternal decision, but in Tommy's warped reality, it was an act of war. The final, fatal confrontation was set in motion by a seemingly trivial amount of money. Thomas Sr. decided to reduce Tommy's weekly allowance from $400 to $300. He also threatened to stop paying the rent on his son's apartment. To the Gilbert family, this was a drop in the ocean of their wealth. To Tommy, it was an existential threat. It was a rejection, a withdrawal of what he considered his lifeblood. The allowance and the apartment were the pillars of his identity, the symbols of the life he felt he was owed. His father was threatening to take it all away. In the days leading up to the murder, Tommy's actions showed a chilling premeditation. He went online and browsed a website called hire-a-killer.com. Then, using an illegal gun permit, he purchased a .40 caliber Glock handgun. The plan was forming. If his father would not give him the life he wanted, he would take it. On the afternoon of January 4th, 2015, Tommy Gilbert Jr. went to his parents' 8th-floor apartment in the exclusive Beekman Place neighborhood of Manhattan. He arrived calm and composed. He found his parents at home. Then he made a simple, chilling request. He asked his mother, Shelley, to go out and get him a sandwich and a soda. He wanted her out of the apartment. He needed to be alone with his father. Shelley, accustomed to her son's requests and perhaps sensing nothing amiss, agreed. She left the apartment to run the errand. The moment the door closed behind her, Tommy confronted his father. There was no prolonged argument, no physical struggle. There was only the cold, final logic of his plan. He pulled out the Glock handgun and shot his father once in the head. Thomas Gilbert Sr., the 70-year-old Wall Street magnate, collapsed onto his bedroom floor, killed instantly by the son he had spent a lifetime supporting. Tommy then moved to the final step of his plan. He placed the gun in his father's left hand, resting it on his chest in a clumsy attempt to stage the scene as a suicide. He then calmly walked out of the apartment, pulling the hood of his sweatshirt over his head to obscure his face from security cameras, and returned to his own apartment in Chelsea. When Shelley Gilbert returned a short time later, sandwich in hand, she found her husband's bedroom door closed. She knocked, but there was no answer. When she opened the door, she was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Her husband was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, the gun resting on his chest. Her first grief-stricken instinct was to call 911. Her call, played later in court, was a raw recording of a mother's and a wife's world collapsing in a single moment. The police arrived to what was, for them, a very suspicious scene. The suicide was all wrong. Thomas Sr. was right-handed, yet the gun was in his left hand. The placement on his chest was unnatural for a self-inflicted wound. The single shot, with no hesitation marks, also seemed unlikely for a suicide. And then there was Shelley's account of her son's strange request and his presence just moments before the death. Suspicion immediately fell on Tommy. Within hours, a team of police officers descended on Tommy's Chelsea apartment. They found him there, calm and detached. In his apartment, they found the box for the Glock, spent shell casings, and a speed loader. The evidence was overwhelming. Tommy Gilbert Jr. was arrested and charged with the murder of his father. The trial, which began in 2019, put the Gilbert family's entire dysfunctional history on public display. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Craig Ortner, presented a simple and damning narrative. This was a classic case of murder motivated by greed. Tommy, they argued, was a spoiled, entitled man-child who killed his father in a cold-blooded, premeditated act when his allowance was threatened. He was not insane. He was angry that the bank was closing. The evidence of his planning the website, the gun purchase, the ruse to get his mother out of the apartment all pointed to a clear and rational, if monstrous, mind at work. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Tommy was not legally responsible for his actions. They mounted an insanity defense, arguing that he suffered from severe mental illnesses, including schizophrenia and schizotypal personality disorder, which made him unable to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. They presented testimony from psychiatrists who described Tommy's long history of paranoia and delusional thinking. His mother, Shelley, in a heartbreaking display of a mother's conflicted love, testified for the defense, detailing her son's long, slow descent into mental illness. She believed her son was sick, not evil. The jury was faced with the difficult task to distinguish between genuine, debilitating mental illness and extreme, narcissistic rage. They listened to weeks of testimony, examining every detail of Tommy's life, from his privileged upbringing to his bizarre behavior in the years leading up to the murder. In the end, the prosecution's narrative proved more compelling. The jury rejected the insanity defense. They concluded that while Tommy Gilbert Jr. was undoubtedly a disturbed individual, he knew exactly what he was doing on January 4, 2015. He had a clear motive. He planned the murder, and he attempted to cover it up. On June 28, 2019, he was found guilty of murder in the second degree and 2 counts of criminal possession of a weapon. At his sentencing, he remained silent and emotionless. He was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The story of Tommy Gilbert Jr. is a modern-day Greek tragedy set against the backdrop of Manhattan's high society. It is a testament to the fact that money cannot buy happiness, nor can it cure a sickness of the mind. It is a story of a son so consumed by his own perceived needs that he viewed his father's life as a mere transaction, a problem to be eliminated. The inheritance he sought was not just his father's fortune, but the continuation of a lifestyle he was unwilling to earn and could not live without. In the end, his single act of violence cost him that lifestyle, his freedom, and whatever was left of his family. It stands as a chilling reminder that the deadliest threats can come from within one's own home, born from a sense of entitlement so profound that it values a weekly allowance over a father's life. Case 4. The Blood Farm Agreement. A rural family's conspiracy to murder a patriarch over a dispute involving land and inheritance rights. For our final case, we leave the polished surfaces of the city and travel to the heartland of America, to the windswept plains of eastern Kansas. This is a world defined not by stock portfolios or social status, but by the land itself. Here, a person's legacy is measured in acres, in the rich, dark soil passed down through generations. It is a story rooted in this primal connection to the earth, a story of a family who saw their patriarch not as a father, but as a temporary steward of a birthright they were terrified to lose. This is the story of a conspiracy born in a farmhouse kitchen, a plot sealed in blood over the future of a farm. Martin "Marty" Anderson was a man of the land. At 64 years old, He was a hardworking farmer in Dickinson County, a place where life moves at the pace of the seasons. His farm was his life's work, a testament to years of sweat and toil. Marty was a simple man in many ways, known for his straightforward nature and his love for his family. He had 2 children, a son named Clint and a daughter named Megan, from his previous marriage to a woman named Dana. The family dynamic, however, was far from simple. It was a tangled web of past resentments and shifting allegiances. Dana had remarried a man named Justin Hawley, and together they formed a new center of gravity in the family's orbit. The children, Clint and Megan, now young adults, found themselves caught between their father and the powerful influence of their mother and new stepfather. The central point of contention, the source of all the simmering conflict, was the Anderson farm. To Marty, it was his property, his to do with as he pleased. To his children, steeped in the rural tradition of inheritance, the farm was their destiny. It was the land they expected to one day inherit, to work, to pass on to their own children. It was more than an asset, it was their identity. Their sense of entitlement to this land was absolute. In 2012, Marty Anderson made a decision that would unknowingly sign his own death warrant. He had found a new partner, a woman he planned to spend his retirement with. To fund this new chapter of his life, he decided to sell the farm. He wanted to move away, to finally enjoy the fruits of his labor. To a man of 64, this was a logical, well-earned step. To his children and his ex-wife's new family, it was an act of profound betrayal. The news that Marty planned to sell the farm sent a shockwave of panic and rage through the Hawley Anderson clan. Their birthright, the future they had taken for granted, was about to be sold out from under them. The simmering resentment boiled over into a cold, calculated fury. It was in this atmosphere of panic that a monstrous idea began to take root, nurtured and cultivated by the family's new matriarch, Dana Hawley. Dana was the architect of the conspiracy. She saw Marty's plan not just as a financial loss, but as a personal affront. She began to poison the minds of her children, framing their father's decision as a selfish act designed to rob them of their future. She manipulated her son, Clint, a young man described as easily led and desperate for his mother's approval. She told him that his father needed to be taken care of, that something had to be done to stop the sale. Clint, weak-willed and resentful, agreed. The daughter, Megan, was also drawn into the plot, her loyalty to her mother and the promise of the farm overriding any loyalty to her father. With the children on board, Dana turned to her new husband, Justin Hawley. He would be the muscle, the enforcer, who would carry out the final act. The family began to meet, to discuss the Marty problem. They gathered in their homes, turning domestic spaces into war rooms where they plotted the murder of their own patriarch. They discussed methods, alibis, and logistics. It was a family project, a collaborative effort in patricide. They decided that the murder should look like a suicide, a believable end for a man supposedly despondent over his life choices. The weapon would be a shotgun. The time would be Thanksgiving weekend, a time of family gathering that they would twist into an occasion for murder. This was the Blood Farm Agreement. It was an unspoken, unwritten contract between a mother, her 2 children, and her new husband, all bound by a shared sense of entitlement and a cold-blooded determination to secure their inheritance. On the night of Saturday, November 24th, 2012, the plan was put into motion. Justin Hawley was not alone. He enlisted a friend, James "Jimmy" Sloop, to be his driver. They drove out under the vast, star-filled Kansas sky to Marty Anderson's secluded farmhouse. The air was cold and still, the silence of the plains broken only by the sound of their truck rolling down the long, dirt driveway. Justin Hawley, armed with a 12-gauge shotgun, entered the house. Marty Anderson was inside, likely asleep or resting, unaware of the mortal danger that had just crossed his threshold. There was no confrontation, no final words. There was only the deafening roar of the shotgun, once, and then a second time, tearing through the quiet of the farmhouse. Marty Anderson was shot in the chest and head. Their bloody work done, Holly and Sloop said about their clumsy attempt to stage the scene. They placed the shotgun near Marty's body, hoping it would look like he had taken his own life. They then left the farmhouse, melting back into the night, leaving the patriarch to be found in his own home, a victim of his family's grotesque greed. The following Monday, when Marty failed to show up for work, a concerned coworker went to check on him. The scene they discovered was grim. The authorities were called, and the investigation began. Initially, the theory of suicide was considered, just as the conspirators had planned. But to the trained eyes of the investigators from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, the scene felt wrong. The position of the body and the weapon was inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound. The story of a sudden suicide from a man who was actively making plans for his future didn't add up. The investigators began to talk to the family, and the cracks in the conspiracy quickly appeared. They sensed the strange, toxic dynamics at play. They noted the lack of genuine grief from the children, Clint and Megan. They picked up on the undercurrent of hostility from Dana and Justin Holly. The family, so tightly bound in their conspiracy, was unable to convincingly fake the emotions of loss. The key to unlocking the case came from the weakest link in the chain, Clint Anderson. Weighed down by guilt and pressured by investigators, the son broke. In a series of interviews, he confessed to his role in the plot. He laid out the entire conspiracy for the police, his mother's manipulation, his sister's complicity, and his stepfather's role as the triggerman. He told them about the meetings, the motive, and the plan to stage it as a suicide. The blood farm agreement was no longer a secret. With Clint's confession, the dominoes began to fall, one by one. Justin Holly, Dana Holly, Megan Moten, her married name, and Jimmy Sloop were all arrested. The family that had conspired together to commit murder was now facing justice together. The legal proceedings that followed painted a sickening portrait of a family completely consumed by greed. Each conspirator received a different fate. Justin Holly, the man who pulled the trigger, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Dana Holly, the manipulative mastermind, was also convicted of first-degree murder and received the same sentence. Megan Moten, the daughter, pleaded no contest to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to nearly 10 years in prison. And Clint Anderson, the son whose confession broke the case, pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of solicitation of murder and received a significantly reduced sentence for his cooperation. The story of the Anderson family is a stark and brutal parable about the corrupting power of entitlement. It is a story where the love for land completely eclipsed the love for a father. The inheritance they so desperately coveted was a piece of earth, a collection of buildings, a title deed. To secure it, they committed the most unnatural of acts, severing the most fundamental of human bonds. The farm, the very thing that was the object of their deadly desire, is now forever stained by this legacy. It is no longer a symbol of generational wealth, but a monument to a family's moral decay. The harvest they reaped was not of crops, but of devastation, imprisonment, and a betrayal so profound it defies comprehension. It stands as a chilling reminder that in the quiet heartland, greed can grow as wild and as dangerously as any weed, choking out all that is good until nothing is left but a field of sorrow. And with that, our folio on inheritance closes. We have journeyed through 4 different worlds: the opulence of Beverly Hills, the quiet streets of suburbia, the towers of Manhattan, and the farmlands of Kansas. Yet in each world, We found the same poison at work, a greed so powerful it severed the sacred bonds of family. An inheritance is meant to be a final gift, a legacy of love and provision. But in these stories, it became a motive, a curse that transformed children into killers and parents into targets. The trust that should define a family was weaponized, and the home, meant to be a sanctuary, became a stage for the ultimate betrayal. These tales are a somber reminder that the human heart's capacity for darkness is not limited by wealth or status, and that the most devastating price for money is the loss of one's own humanity. May your own homes be a sanctuary. Sleep well.